Seizing central space immediately, this pawn aims to dictate the early positional struggle. Instantly contesting the center and preparing for dynamic central action, this knight development is a classic response. Securing the center and preparing for kingside development, white aims for a flexible pawn structure. Embracing fianchetto king's Indian, preparing bishop development for long-range pressure. Asserting central dominion, c4 immediately challenges black's fianchetto formation by contesting the d5 square and paving the way for queenside expansion. Developing the bishop here establishes a classic fianchetto structure, eyeing the queenside and reinforcing the pawn chain. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing a kingside fianchetto, this move aims for harmonious piece development. Securing the king's safety is paramount, freeing up the pieces for central engagement. Solidifying the kingside dark squares, this fianchetto prepares to control the long diagonal and bolster the central pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn chain, d6 now supports the central advance and prepares for queenside development, potentially challenging white's early space advantage. Fortifying the king's sanctuary before launching central operations secures vital lines for future piece development. Developing the knight to its natural outpost solidifies black's central presence and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Pawn thrust bravely claiming central space, though it slightly cramps your own pieces while creating immediate queenside tension. Seeking initiative on the queenside, this knight ventures out, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially create an outpost on c4. Solidifying the center's grip and preparing to launch an offensive on the queenside, this knight repositioning anticipates further queenside pawn advances and potential tactical exchanges. Slamming the door on white's queenside expansion, black crystallizes a tense pawn chain, sacrificing central space for potential counterplay. Recalibrating white's central presence, this knight redeploys to contest the d7 square, indirectly supporting a potential e4 push. Gaining queenside space while preparing a potential queenside advance is a sound positional adjustment. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure now prevents black from exploiting any weaknesses there. Repositioning the bishop opens diagonals and prepares for pawn breaks, creating dynamic counterplay on the queenside. This pawn push aims to seize central space and restrict black's pieces, particularly the knight on a5. Challenging the central pawn advance, this bishop's sortie activates it, eyeing the kingside and potentially disrupting white's coordination. Unlocking the kingside attack, this pawn push forces black into a defensive posture, potentially creating weaknesses around their king. The bishop seeks active squares, aiming to participate in the central pawn battle and potentially harass white's queenside. Initiating a knight outpost on d3 aims to exert pressure along the central files and potentially support a kingside attack. Exploiting the queenside space imbalance, black aggressively challenges white's central structure and aims to undermine the pawn chain. Reinforcing the queenside pawns prevents black's rapid expansion. Fortifying the pawn chain's advance, this rook now aims to pressure white's queen flank, potentially creating a critical imbalance. The bishop finds a more active diagonal, eyeing black's potentially exposed queenside pawns and preparing for an eventual queenside expansion. Confronting white's central dominance, black boldly challenges the d5 pawn, opening avenues while risking a pawn majority exchange. Sharpening the attack on the queenside, the bishop finds a more aggressive diagonal. Initiating a knight sortie towards the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and exploit any lingering weaknesses on the h-file. Exploiting the knight's misplaced position, white initiates a sharp pawn thrust to crack open the center. Opening the e-file here gambles space for a potential initiative on the kingside. Striking at the core, this exchange clears the way for centralized pressure, though it weakens the dark squares. Relinquishing castling rights to solidify the pawn structure here frees the king, but leaves it more exposed to potential central attacks. Opening the g-file offers a direct assault on the exposed black king. Capturing the pawn opens the b-file for your rook, creating dynamic play and challenging white's central pawn structure. Opening the b-file presents a dynamic confrontation, immediately challenging black's pawn structure and aiming to exploit the open lines. Initiating a queenside invasion. The rook's new outpost on the open file immediately threatens to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Instantly seizing the open queen's file after the exchange, this queenside redistribution offers potential counterplay. Activating the queen to the kingside and pressuring white's pawn structure could be the idea here, potentially preparing for future advances. Unlocking the queen's potential along the a1-h8 diagonal, preparing to harass black's pawn chain. An immediate queen trade simplifies things, potentially heading towards an endgame where pawn weaknesses might become more prominent. Reclaiming the open file now permits relentless pressure on the queen side, potentially forcing weaknesses. Reactivating the rook on the open file aims to challenge white's queenside control and prepare for potential future advances. Opening the rook file for pressure against black's isolated pawns. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure solidifies defense and prepares for a potential queenside pawn storm. This repositioning of the rook frees the pawn and prepares for a potential kingside initiative, eyeing weaknesses near the enemy monarch. The rook retreats, preparing to contest the semi-open c-file and support its advancing pawns. Pivoting the bishop to create a defensive shield for the kingside. The knight repositions, eyeing the c5 square while preparing a potential kingside advance. Exchanging bishops resolves the pawn structure tension, offering a clearer path for white's remaining pieces. Opening the g-file to attack the doubled pawns creates a permanent weakness around your king. Securing the king initiates a gradual centralization, preparing to contest open files and influence the queenside majority. Aggressively pushing the queenside pawns now may be a desperate attempt to create counterplay on an otherwise passive flank. Preparing to activate the king, aiming for central influence and potential breakthroughs in the evolving pawn structure. Pressing the queenside further, this advance seeks to create imbalances and open up new avenues for attack. A prophylactic measure, preventing the knight's infiltration to g5 and securing the king's airspace. Reinforcing the queenside pawn chain gains valuable space and activates the bishop for potential discoveries. Opening the king's diagonal for potential breakthroughs across the board. The bishop sacrifices itself, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially gain initiative in a simplified endgame. Unleashing a pawn storm in the center, white disrupts black's defensive setup and opens critical lines. Sacrificing pawns for open lines here is a daring attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and open the king. Opening lines for white's king and gaining space on the queen side. This recapture finally unlocks the central dark squares, potentially empowering your bishop and creating dynamic attacking chances. Opening up the e-file for your rooks could prove decisive in this endgame. Exploring the open file for the bishop creates immediate pressure and probes white's central weaknesses. Liberating the bishop to attack the queenside pawns provides immediate tactical pressure. Reclaiming central space, black decisively removes white's attacking knight, aiming to untangle their position and prepare for the endgame transition. The white knight seizes a crucial outpost, threatening black's weakened queenside pawn structure and opening lines for attack. Initiating counterplay along the g-file, the rook seeks active participation and a potential re-entry onto the board. Repositioning the rook to a more active file immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens avenues for future pressure. Unleashing a bishop to the active diagonal offers counterplay and aims to disrupt white's consolidated position. Exploiting the open files, white aims to pressure black's weakened king and potentially win material. Unleashing the rook to penetrate the weakened kingside, aiming to exploit the exposed white king. Reactivating the knight to the center offers dynamic attacking possibilities and better piece activity. Seeking to exploit the open king and weak pawn structure, black aggressively advances the rook, forcing white's king to an exposed position. Protecting the king from further harassment becomes paramount, stabilizing the position after the sharp sequence. Unleashing a dangerous discovered check, black aims to exploit the exposed white king and regain the initiative. Relocating the king to the corner avoids the immediate check threat and prepares for a potential pawn push or knight repositioning. The bishop now eyes the exposed white king, creating immediate attacking potential. Opening the c-file creates a new avenue of attack. A desperate king hunt begins, desperately seeking activity to avoid being steamrolled. Securing the king's escape route is paramount with the open lines and black's menacing pieces. The rook re-enters the fray, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and exploit the open files. The white king awkwardly shuffles, leaving pawns exposed and king's safety compromised for a passive pawn advance. A bold maneuver, reclaiming lost material, but exposing the king to further attacks across the open diagonals. Snatches a pawn, but exposes the king to potential checks and sacrifices, opening up black's remaining pieces. The king desperately scrambles for safety, but the rook's advance creates a deadly diagonal threat. Securing the pawn's advance is paramount before launching a deeper penetration with the king. The rook now swings to the 7th rank, threatening to disrupt white's kingside coordination and potentially create mating threats. Unlocking the c-file with this pawn thrust creates winning threats against black's king. The king's exposed position now beckons for black's active rook. King activity finally begins to stir, seeking central influence on a contested board. Seizing the initiative, black reroutes the rook to menace the weakened queenside pawn structure. Clearing the path for the king's escape route, aiming to activate the rook on the 7th rank. The rook retreats, seeking better coordination for a final push towards the open files. The passed pawn's relentless march toward promotion now presents a decisive tactical threat. Securing the critical passed pawn's advance, the rook's repositioning now aims to halt white's decisive monarch push. Sacrificing material for a decisive king hunt, exploiting black's exposed monarch. This retreat aims to centralize the king and prepare for the queen's rook to join the defense, but it leaves the king exposed to immediate checks. Sacrificing the knight opens a clear path for the rook, aiming to infiltrate black's weakened position. Protecting the king becomes paramount as the rook emerges from hiding to offer support. Recapturing the knight opens the c-file, inviting pawn races and potentially trapping black's king. Unveiling a crucial check that will disrupt the white king's precarious safety. Unleashing the king into a potential knight fork requires immense confidence, or perhaps a calculated gamble. Pushing the h-pawn offers a vital escape square for the king and disrupts white's coordination. King hunting intensifies as the knight clears the path to a devastating check. The king's central advance might be a tactical gamble, exposing it to potential checks in this complex endgame. Pushing the rook into a more active attacking posture, threatening to cut off the black king's escape and target the pawn on h4. Doubling down on the queenside defense, but it allows white a decisive kingside initiative. Pushing this pawn relentlessly advances white's winning chance by blocking black's bishop. Diverting the bishop to the queenside opens new avenues for the black king's safety. Initiating a desperate retreat for the knight, seeking safer squares as the passed pawn's march intensifies. A last desperate attempt to stir up trouble, sacrificing the pawn for potential chaos. Sacrificing the rook to achieve a mating net around black's king with the remaining pieces. The king, suddenly exposed after the rook exchange, is now a prime target for white's remaining pieces. Retreating the rook to defend the pawn ensures the king remains active and avoids an immediate pawn race. The king's flight path is now severely restricted, as the pawn push offers a clear escape route. Centering the king opens up its defensive capabilities, while eyeing the pawn on h4.